He was walking through the forest, expecting nothing unusual, but his dog led him to a place that should not have existed. An abandoned helicopter, hidden among the trees for decades, concealed a truth that was meant to be forgotten, and what he discovered inside changed his view of everything and forced him to face a choice he could not escape. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The forest had never been a place of mystery for him. It was work, routine, and discipline shaped by years of moving through terrain where mistakes were paid for with blood, hunger, or slow exhaustion. He knew how to read the ground the way other men read paper maps. He understood how wind bent the grass, how birds reacted to intruders, how the silence of insects could warn more clearly than any alarm. The forest did not frighten him, and he did not romanticize it. It was neither enemy nor friend. It was simply a system, old and indifferent, and he had learned how to exist inside it without drawing attention to himself. He had grown into this life deliberately. Solitude was not something he endured. It was something he chose. People talked too much, promised things they could not keep, and trusted systems that abandoned them the moment they became inconvenient. Out here, there were no explanations and no excuses. Every step mattered. Every choice left a trace. If something went wrong, there was no one to blame but yourself. That honesty had shaped him far more than any town or job ever could. His skin marked him as different in places where hunters still measured belonging by tradition rather than skill, and over time he had learned to let competence speak instead of words. He avoided gatherings, avoided questions, avoided anything that could pull him back into other people's narratives. The forest gave him something simpler. It allowed him to exist without justification. Beside him moved his dog, a disciplined animal with a quiet presence that matched his own. The dog was not a companion in the sentimental sense, but a partner trained through patience and repetition. They worked without noise, without wasted motion. The dog checked ahead, returned, watched his hands and posture. It understood the difference between pursuit and caution, between curiosity and danger. When it acted out of pattern, he noticed immediately. That morning had begun like countless others. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of old leaves and slow decay. The forest here was ancient, untouched by tourists or marked trails. Trees rose thick and tall, their roots breaking the surface of the earth like knotted veins. Fallen trunks lay where they had collapsed decades ago, slowly dissolving into the soil. Moss covered everything, softening edges, swallowing sharp lines. The ground yielded slightly underfoot, a living mat layered with centuries of growth and collapse. He had chosen the route deliberately, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. No shortcuts, no cleared paths. He preferred terrain that forced attention. His movements were measured, economical. He noted the direction of the wind, the angle of light filtering through the canopy, the faint patterns in the undergrowth that hinted at animals passing during the night. Nothing suggested danger. Nothing suggested surprise. Until the dog changed direction. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture, a pause longer than usual. Then the animal moved off the intended line with quiet insistence, nose low, body tense in a way that signaled focus rather than excitement. This was not prey behavior. There was no rush, no erratic movement. It was deliberate, almost purposeful. He stopped and waited, watching. The dog circled once, returned halfway, then turned again, clearly inviting him to follow. He frowned, scanned the surroundings. The forest looked the same as it had minutes earlier. No fresh tracks, no broken brush, no scent of animals he could identify. Still, something had changed. He called the dog back with a low signal. It hesitated, then came, but the tension remained. When he set off again on the original path, the dog followed for several minutes before slowing, then stopping entirely. Its ears shifted, its attention fixed on the direction it had first chosen. He felt the unease then, not fear, but the quiet recognition that the balance he trusted had shifted. Dogs did not argue without reason. He weighed his options. Turning back was always possible. Pushing forward into unfamiliar ground always carried risk. But ignoring a warning carried its own cost. He adjusted his pack, marked the nearest tree with a small, deliberate break in a branch, and followed. The forest grew denser as they moved. Light thinned. The air became cooler, heavier, carrying a faint scent he could not immediately place. Metal, perhaps, but old, diluted by decades of moisture and decay. He slowed, scanning the ground more carefully now. The soil changed underfoot, less springy, more compacted. Rocks appeared where there should have been only leaf litter. He noticed the first human trace almost without realizing it. A sliver of something unnatural half buried near a root, dulled by time. He crouched, brushed away dirt, and revealed a fragment of fabric unlike anything modern. Thick, coarse, faded beyond color. He let it fall back into the earth, his pulse steady but alert. The forest was quieter here, not silent, but subdued. Birds called from a distance, but none nearby. Insects were fewer. It was the kind of quiet that settled over places animals avoided, places that carried old disturbances that never quite faded. The dog slowed, then stopped entirely. Ahead, the trees opened slightly, forming a space that felt wrong in its geometry. Nature rarely cleared itself this way. The ground sloped gently downward, the vegetation thinner, younger. He stepped forward carefully, each sense stretched tight. That was when he saw the shape. At first, it was nothing more than an irregular mass among trunks and vines. His mind tried to classify it as a fallen tree, a rock formation, anything that belonged. But the longer he looked, the more the lines refused to align with natural logic. There was symmetry where there should have been chaos. Curves that suggested intention rather than erosion. He moved closer. Metal emerged from beneath layers of moss and bark, not shiny, not reflective, but unmistakably shaped by human hands. A long, cylindrical body half swallowed by earth. A shattered canopy opening like a broken eye. Twisted blades caught high in branches, frozen mid-rotation as if time itself had stalled. A helicopter. It lay there like a fossil, embedded in the forest as though it had grown there. Vines wrapped around its frame. Roots pierced its skin. Rust ate through its surface in slow, patient waves. The forest had not merely hidden it, it had claimed it. He stood still for a long time, absorbing the impossibility of it. No maps marked this place. No stories he knew mentioned a crash here. A machine of this size did not simply vanish without notice. And yet it had. The dog refused to approach, stopping at the edge of the clearing, watching him with an intensity that bordered on warning. He circled the wreck slowly, careful where he placed his feet. There were no signs of explosion, no scorched earth, no scattered debris field. The damage suggested a hard landing rather than a violent crash. The body was battered but largely intact. One door hung open, warped but not torn free. The other appeared to have been closed deliberately. Time pressed against him in strange ways. The forest around the helicopter felt older, heavier, as though the years had layered themselves differently here. He traced the faint remains of markings on the hull, letters nearly erased by rust and lichen. Military, without doubt, from another era entirely. He felt a shift inside himself then, a subtle tightening. This was no longer a simple anomaly. It was a story that had been interrupted and buried. The smell inside the wreck reached him even before he stepped closer. Old metal, rot, something faintly smoky that should not have survived so long. He hesitated at the threshold, listening. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. When he finally stepped closer, it was with the care of someone entering a place that demanded respect. Not a trophy, not a curiosity. Something closer to a grave. The forest had kept this secret for decades, and now, by following his dog into ground he had not intended to cross, he had become part of it. He did not know yet that this moment marked the end of his ordinary days, only that turning away would not return him to who he had been before. He did not step inside immediately. After the first shock settled, instinct took over, the same instinct that had kept him alive through years of solitary movement in places where rescue was a concept rather than a promise. He widened his circle around the wreck, forcing himself to slow down, to see rather than react. Whatever this was, it had been here long before him and would remain long after he left. Rushing would serve nothing. From a distance, the helicopter looked almost organic, as if it had grown out of the ground rather than fallen from the sky. The forest had reshaped it patiently, season by season. Thick vines wrapped around the fuselage, some disappearing through jagged holes in the metal and emerging elsewhere, as if threading the machine together. Moss softened the harsh lines of its structure, dulling the angles that once spoke of speed and power. Tree roots had pushed through weak points in the hull, splitting panels apart with slow, irresistible force. The machine had not been destroyed, it had been absorbed. As he moved closer, details emerged that deepened the unease. The landing gear was twisted but not torn away. The ground beneath it bore the compressed memory of impact, a wide, shallow depression where tons of metal had slammed into soil that had never expected it. Young trees grew at the edges of this scar, their thinner trunks rising where older growth had once been flattened by the force of the descent. Nature had erased the violence, but not completely. He knelt and touched the metal with 2 fingers. It was cold, damp, rough beneath the layer of corrosion. Rust flaked away at his touch, staining his skin a dull red. This was not a recent wreck. The corrosion was deep, layered, the kind that came only from decades of exposure. 70 years, perhaps more. Long enough for entire lives to pass without anyone knowing this place existed. The blades were frozen high above, caught in branches that had grown thick around them. He studied their angle, the way they had torn into the canopy and then stopped. It suggested a controlled descent that had gone wrong at the last moment. A pilot fighting gravity until there was nothing left to fight with. There were no signs of fire. No blackened soil, no melted components. Whatever had brought the helicopter down, it had not ended in an explosion. He moved along the side, tracing the outline of the cabin. One door hung partially open, bent inward as if forced by hand rather than impact. The other remained closed, its frame warped but intact. Glass from the cockpit canopy was missing in places, shattered and long since scattered or buried, but some fragments remained embedded in the surrounding wood, dull and opaque from years of weather. Faded markings clung to the hull like ghosts. Letters almost erased. Symbols he recognized only vaguely, the style unmistakably military, but from an era far removed from the present. The paint beneath the rust hinted at camouflage patterns no longer in use. He tried to imagine this machine once cutting through open air, loud, visible, powerful, and the contrast felt absurd. Now it was silent, invisible, surrendered. The dog remained at the edge of the clearing, unmoving. Its refusal to approach unsettled him more than the wreck itself. The animal was not afraid, exactly, but wary, as if recognizing that this was not simply an object but a boundary. He glanced back at it, then returned his focus to the helicopter. The ground around the wreck told its own story. Stones had been dragged into rough circles, now half sunk into the earth. Old fire pits lay scattered nearby, their outlines barely visible beneath layers of leaf litter. These were not the marks of curious passers-by. They were the signs of habitation. Temporary, desperate, but intentional. That realization slowed his breathing. This place was not just where something had ended. It was where something had continued. He approached the open door cautiously, testing the stability of the frame, before leaning his weight toward it. The metal groaned softly, a sound more like an exhale than a warning. Inside, darkness pressed close, thickened by years of neglect. He waited, letting his eyes adjust. The smell reached him first. Damp metal, rot, old fabric. Beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the ghost of smoke. Wood smoke. The kind that came from repeated fires, not a single blaze. The scent lingered in the enclosed space as if the air itself remembered. He stepped inside. The interior was smaller than he expected, but not chaotic. That struck him immediately. He had seen wrecks before, machines torn apart by impact or violence. This was different. The seats had been moved, not ripped free. Some had been removed entirely, stacked or repurposed. Storage compartments stood open, their contents rearranged with care. Cloth hung from makeshift hooks, stiff with age. Light filtered in through holes in the hull and broken windows, cutting the darkness into narrow shafts. Dust motes drifted lazily, disturbed by his presence for the first time in years. The floor beneath his boots felt solid enough, though warped in places where corrosion had eaten deep. He moved slowly, taking everything in. Someone had tried to make this space livable, not comfortable, but survivable. Improvised shelves held rusted utensils and containers. Strips of fabric had been tied along the interior walls, likely to block rain or cold drafts. The arrangement was methodical, disciplined. Whoever had done this had expected to stay. He crouched near the rear of the cabin, examining a cluster of items tucked neatly into a corner, clothing folded carefully despite its age, boots placed side by side, their leather cracked but intact, personal effects stored in small metal tins sealed against moisture. These were not the belongings of people who had given up. They were the belongings of people who planned. The weight of that settled over him slowly. This helicopter had not been abandoned in panic. It had become a shelter. He straightened and scanned the cabin again, his mind shifting from observer to investigator. The controlled nature of the landing, the lack of fire, the evidence of long-term habitation. All of it pointed toward a story far more complex than a simple crash. Outside, the forest pressed in quietly, patient as ever. It had hidden this place well, folding it into itself layer by layer, but it had not erased it completely. And now that the secret had been uncovered, even briefly, it felt as though the clearing itself was holding its breath. He glanced once more toward the dog at the edge of the trees. The animal met his gaze, still, alert, waiting. He understood then that whatever lay ahead would not be confined to this machine alone. The helicopter was only the center of something larger, a point where paths converged and then vanished. He took a deeper breath and stepped further inside, knowing that once he committed to understanding what had happened here, there would be no simple way back to ignorance. Once he crossed the threshold fully, the sense of intrusion deepened. The helicopter no longer felt like wreckage, but like a room abandoned mid-thought, a place where intention still clung to the walls. He moved carefully, not only because of the unstable metal beneath his boots, but because every object seemed to demand consideration. Nothing here was random. Nothing had been left behind by accident. The first thing that struck him was how the interior had been altered. The original configuration of the cabin had been deliberately changed. Seats had been unbolted and repositioned to create space along the walls. Some had been removed entirely, their absence leaving behind exposed mounts and faded outlines where they once rested. In their place were makeshift sleeping areas constructed from layered fabric, padding torn from seats, and strips of canvas stretched tight and tied with wire. These were not crude gestures of desperation. They were calculated, repeated, improved over time. Hooks fashioned from bent metal protruded from structural ribs, each one positioned at a height and angle that suggested frequent use. On them hung remnants of clothing, stiff with age and mold, yet still arranged with care. Shirts folded over themselves, trousers draped evenly. A jacket hung apart from the rest as if reserved for colder nights. He could almost see the routine that must have governed these small decisions, the discipline of people who understood that order was a form of resistance against chaos. Near the forward section of the cabin, he found a small cluster of containers secured with wire to prevent them from shifting. Inside were utensils dulled by rust but cleaned enough to show they had been maintained. A cup with a cracked handle. A dented tin that once held food, repurposed as storage. A blade sharpened down to a narrow edge, its handle wrapped in fabric strips to protect the hand. These were tools of survival, not remnants of a last meal. He knelt and examined the floor more closely. The metal bore the marks of repeated movement, faint scuffs worn into the surface where boots had passed back and forth over weeks, perhaps months. In one area, the wear was deeper, the pattern more concentrated, suggesting a place where someone had spent long hours sitting, working, waiting. It was the kind of detail no one noticed unless they knew how to look, unless they understood how time reshaped spaces when people were forced to stay still. Along one wall, he found medical supplies, or what remained of them. Bandages yellowed with age, some stained dark where blood had once soaked through. Empty blister packs crushed flat. A splint fashioned from thin wood and wrapped tightly with cloth. Someone had been injured badly enough to require care, and someone else had known how to provide it. The stains on the wall nearby were old, brown, and flaked, but unmistakable. This had not been an instant death. Pain had been lived with here, managed, endured. The realization tightened something in his chest. He had expected bones, perhaps, or signs of sudden violence. Instead, he found evidence of effort, of people refusing to disappear quietly. He reached into a recessed compartment near the rear of the cabin and withdrew a small metal box. It resisted at first, then came free with a soft scrape. Inside, protected from moisture and time, were personal items that shifted the story from collective to individual. Identification tags lay stacked together, not scattered. Photographs wrapped in cloth, faces barely visible but still human, still specific. A ring placed carefully beside them, its surface dulled but intact. These were not things people left behind lightly. They had been gathered, preserved, perhaps entrusted to someone with the intention that they would be carried out of this forest someday. He replaced the items exactly as he found them and continued his inspection. In the forward section, tucked beneath a panel that had been pried open and then carefully closed again, he found a notebook. Its cover was worn, the pages inside stiff but legible. He hesitated before opening it, aware that this would change the nature of what he was doing. Observation would turn into reading. Distance would give way to intimacy. The first entries were brief and practical. Weather notes, inventory counts, mentions of water sources, and failed attempts to repair damaged systems. The handwriting was steady, controlled. There was no panic in the lines, only focus. Dates followed, marked clearly. He paused when he realized how far those dates extended. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The timeline stretched well beyond what any official report would have allowed. Later, entries grew shorter, but not weaker. The writing tightened, conserving space and energy. There were notes about rationing, about pain, about keeping routines. Mentions of sounds heard in the distance. Aircraft, engines, signals attempted and unanswered. One line, written heavier than the rest, mentioned seeing a plane pass overhead without altering course. He closed the notebook slowly. The implication settled over him like weight. These people had been alive. They had been waiting. And at some point, someone had known where they were and chosen not to come. He resumed his search with renewed intensity, his mind now attuned to patterns of abandonment rather than accident. Outside the helicopter, he found evidence that supported what the interior suggested. Fire pits positioned to minimize smoke. Stones arranged to shield flames from view. Strips of fabric hung in places where they could catch light but be removed quickly. They had tried to be seen without being obvious. They had balanced hope with caution. Near one of the fire pits, half buried beneath soil and roots, he uncovered a scrap of brightly colored cloth, preserved where moisture had not reached it. It was the kind of color meant to be visible from the air. He imagined it once waved desperately, then hidden away when nothing came. Back inside, he found more writing, not in the notebook but etched faintly into the metal walls. Tallies, short phrases, names repeated and then crossed out. A count of days scratched into a panel near where someone must have slept. These markings were harder to see, more fragile, but they spoke of time measured in survival rather than calendars. One small detail stopped him completely. Near the front of the cabin, wedged between two panels, was a folded piece of fabric tied with a thin cord. Inside it was a photograph, smaller than the others, protected with unusual care. The image showed a child, standing awkwardly, smiling with uncertainty. The edges of the photo were worn smooth from being handled often. Someone had looked at this many times, probably at night, probably when the forest grew too quiet. He held it for a long moment, then returned it to its place. That was when he noticed the reference in the notebook he had missed before. A single line, easy to overlook among the practical notes. A mention of securing the cargo. A reminder written more than once, as if repetition could ensure it would not be forgotten. He flipped back through the pages and found another reference, then another. Always vague, always cautious, never specific. Cargo. His gaze shifted, scanning the cabin with new intent. He looked at the structure of the helicopter differently now, noting panels that seemed more reinforced, spaces that did not align with standard design. The people who had lived here had not only tried to survive, they had been guarding something. He felt the weight of the forest press closer around the machine, as if time itself leaned in to listen. The helicopter was no longer just evidence of abandonment. It was a container of secrets layered one atop another, and he had only just begun to peel them back. Outside, the dog shifted position, alert again, ears angled toward the deeper forest. He sensed the pull of something beyond the wreck, something connected to what had been taken and what had been left behind. The hunter closed the compartment and stepped back, his understanding reshaped. Whatever had happened here had not ended with the helicopter. It had continued outward, carried on human feet into the forest, leaving traces that waited to be read. And now that he knew these people had lived, had hoped, and had been forgotten, walking away without understanding what they had protected no longer felt like an option. The word stayed with him as he moved through the cabin again, no longer looking at it as a shelter, but as a vessel with a second purpose: cargo. It echoed in his thoughts with an insistence that altered his perception of every surface, every seam in the metal. The helicopter was not just a place where men had waited to be rescued. It was something closer to a locked container, stranded far from where its contents were meant to go. He began methodically, letting his habits take over. He traced the internal frame with his eyes, noting where panels had been reinforced and where rivets differed in age or alignment. Years of repairing tools and adapting equipment in the field had taught him to recognize when something had been modified by hand rather than machine. Here and there, beneath layers of corrosion and dirt, he found small inconsistencies. A seam that sat a fraction too straight. A panel whose bolts were not factory standard. Marks where something had been opened and resealed with care. The forest outside pressed close, but inside the helicopter time felt suspended. Dust motes drifted slowly in narrow shafts of light, as if reluctant to settle. He worked patiently, resisting the urge to force anything. Whatever was hidden here had survived decades precisely because no one had rushed it. Behind a section of wall paneling near the center of the fuselage, he found the first true anomaly. The panel resisted slightly, not from rust but from deliberate fastening. He applied pressure evenly, easing it free without bending the metal. Behind it was a narrow cavity, deeper than the structure should have allowed. The space was dry compared to the rest of the cabin, shielded carefully from moisture. Inside lay a crate. It was smaller than he expected, but dense, its weight apparent even before he touched it. The wood was darkened with age, but intact, wrapped in layers of oil-soaked fabric that had hardened into a protective shell. There were no markings anyone would recognize. Only a sequence of numbers and symbols burned lightly into one side, their meaning opaque but intentional. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he searched for more. As his eyes adjusted to this new way of seeing, the helicopter revealed additional secrets. Another cavity beneath the floor panel near the rear. A reinforced compartment built into the structural ribs. Each one concealed a container, some wooden, some metal, all wrapped and sealed with obsessive care. This was not a single item hidden in desperation. It was a shipment. When he finally opened the first crate, the sight inside stole his breath in a quiet, unsettling way. There was no drama, no sudden shock, only a deep, cold recognition of value. Gold lay inside, packed tightly, its surfaces dulled but unmistakable. Bars of varying sizes. Coins from different origins, their markings faint but still legible. This was not ceremonial treasure. It was wealth in its most portable, utilitarian form. He closed the crate slowly and leaned back against the wall, grounding himself. Gold meant motive. Gold meant silence. Gold meant that whatever had happened to these men was never just an accident. One by one, he examined the other containers. Some held more gold. Others held small, carefully padded packages containing stones that caught the light even through layers of grime. There were objects he could not immediately identify, crafted items that looked older than the helicopter itself, wrapped as though they mattered far beyond their material worth. Everything had been catalogued. Slips of paper, preserved in oilcloth, listed contents in careful handwriting. Counts matched weight. Nothing was left to chance. Yet something was missing. As he compared the list to what lay before him, a discrepancy emerged. Small at first, easy to dismiss. A line item that did not correspond to anything he could find. Then another. The totals did not align. The cargo, whatever its original volume, had been reduced. There were no signs of theft, no broken seals, no damage suggesting a frantic search. The absence felt deliberate, calculated. Someone had taken part of the shipment and left the rest untouched. His thoughts returned to the notebook, to the vague references, to the caution in the wording. These men had known what they were carrying, even if they did not know its ultimate destination. They had guarded it, recorded it, protected it from the forest, and at some point they had made a decision. He found more documents tucked into a metal tube sealed with wax. Inside were pages filled with codes rather than language, coordinates perhaps, transfer points, instructions written to obscure meaning rather than clarify it. There were no official seals, no signatures. Whoever had designed this operation had not intended it to survive scrutiny. The implication was clear. This was not simply a military transport gone wrong. It was a transaction interrupted, and when it failed, the men involved became liabilities. He imagined the moment when that realization dawned on them. The days waiting for rescue that never came. The sound of aircraft overhead that did not turn. The slow understanding that they had been abandoned not because they were lost, but because they were inconvenient. The forest outside seemed to lean closer as he considered this. It had been the perfect place to let a problem dissolve. No witnesses, no wreckage officially recovered, no questions that required answers. He sat in the quiet of the cabin, the weight of the knowledge pressing down on him. The gold did not tempt him in the way he might have expected. Instead, it repulsed him slightly, like something unclean. He understood instinctively that touching it carried risk beyond the obvious. Wealth like this did not exist in isolation. It belonged to systems that defended themselves long after the people who built them were gone. His eyes returned to the lists and to the missing portion. Someone had left with part of the cargo. Someone had walked away from this place carrying not only value, but proof. That person had either survived long enough to disappear into the world, or had met their end somewhere beyond the reach of this clearing. The dog shifted outside, restless now, pacing along the edge of the trees. It whined softly, a sound it rarely made. The forest felt different, charged with direction rather than stillness, as if the discovery of the cargo had activated something dormant. He resealed the compartments carefully, restoring them as close to their original state as possible. He did not want to disturb the balance more than he already had. Whatever choice he would make later, this place needed to remain hidden for now. When he stepped back out into the clearing, the air felt heavier. He looked away from the helicopter and into the deeper forest, following the line of terrain with a practiced eye. If someone had left here carrying weight, they would have chosen their path carefully. They would have moved toward water, toward elevation, toward any feature that increased their odds. He knew then that the helicopter was not the end of the story. It was the anchor point, the place where everything had stalled. The real movement, the real decisions had happened beyond it. And if the forest had kept the machine, it might also have kept the trail. Leaving the helicopter did not feel like turning his back on it. It felt more like stepping out of a room where a presence lingered, aware and unfinished. The forest closed around him almost immediately, branches and leaves swallowing the clearing with practiced ease, as if it were correcting a brief disturbance. The wreck remained behind him, silent and patient, but his attention had shifted outward now, pulled by the logic of movement and survival. If someone had taken part of the cargo and left, they had not done so blindly. No one, burdened by weight and pursued by uncertainty, chose a random direction. They followed terrain, water, elevation, patterns that favored endurance over speed. He began to read the land with renewed focus, not as a hunter tracking animals, but as a man following the decisions of other men who had once stood where he stood now. The first signs were subtle enough that an untrained eye would have passed them without notice. A branch snapped at an unnatural angle, not fresh, but preserved where moisture had not yet erased its shape. A stone shifted slightly out of place, pressed into the soil with intention rather than accident. These were old marks, almost erased, but time had layered them rather than destroyed them. The forest, in its own way, remembered. The dog moved ahead with quiet certainty now, no longer hesitant, no longer wary of the helicopter behind them. Its nose traced the ground in slow arcs, pausing where sense had once concentrated, where people had stopped long enough for their presence to sink into the earth. It was not following a trail in the traditional sense. It was following absence. They moved downslope first, toward a shallow depression where water would have gathered during heavy rains. The ground here was firmer, the vegetation slightly different, shaped by periodic flooding and retreat. He knelt and brushed aside leaves, revealing an area of compacted soil that did not match the surrounding texture. Weight had rested here, repeatedly. Nearby, half hidden beneath a layer of moss, lay the remains of a fire pit. Stones arranged in a deliberate circle, not for comfort, but for concealment. The fire would have burned low, shielded from view, its smoke dispersed by the canopy above. This was not a place of rest. It was a place of waiting. He moved slowly around the site, cataloging what little remained. Fragments of metal too small to identify at a glance. A strip of cloth caught beneath a root, its fibers frayed but intact. The fabric matched none of the items he had seen inside the helicopter. This had come from someone's person, not from the wreck. The notebook entries returned to his mind. Mentions of debate, of differing opinions, of time running out. He imagined the arguments that must have taken place here, not spoken loudly but measured and tense. Stay with the machine and hope for rescue, or move on and risk everything. Discipline would have fractured under hunger and exhaustion. Decisions would have hardened into resolve. Further along, the ground rose gently, leading toward higher elevation where visibility improved and water sources thinned. He found the first clear sign of division there. Two paths diverged, not carved but implied by the terrain and the traces left behind. One route led back toward the helicopter, marked faintly by the absence of disturbance. The other moved forward, its subtle scars accumulating over distance. He followed the latter. The trail became clearer as it progressed. Marks appeared on trees, shallow cuts made with care, angled consistently to guide someone who knew how to read them. stones stacked briefly at junctions, now toppled but still recognizable. These were not the marks of panic. They were the marks of planning. The dog paused near a cluster of rocks and began to dig lightly at the soil. He joined it, uncovering a fragment of metal no larger than his palm. It bore a partial imprint, a number pressed into its surface, the rest worn smooth. It looked like a part of a tag or a seal, something meant to identify and verify. That detail altered his understanding again. This was no longer just about survival. Someone had been concerned with record and proof even while walking away from the wreck. The next site lay near a narrow stream, its course shallow but persistent. Here, the signs of human presence were more pronounced. The ground was trampled, the banks disturbed where water had been collected. He found evidence of wounds tended and retended, cloth strips soaked and rinsed repeatedly. Someone had been injured badly enough to slow the group, yet they had continued. Scattered among the debris were items that did not belong to the forest. A scrap of packaging from far beyond this region, a piece of paper, long since degraded, its ink smeared but its texture unmistakable. These were not things that should have been here unless someone had carried them from somewhere else. He followed the stream until it widened and bent sharply. On a rise overlooking the water, he found the place that felt like an ending. The vegetation here was younger, thinner, as though something had burned long ago and allowed new growth to take hold. Charred stones lay buried beneath soil and roots, their surfaces cracked by intense heat. This had not been a cooking fire. This had been destruction. He uncovered fragments of metal warped by flame, parts of containers that had once held something important enough to warrant erasure. The fire had been controlled, deliberate, hot enough to destroy but not to draw attention from afar. Someone had wanted to remove evidence, not signal for help. The implications pressed in on him. This was where a final decision had been made: to carry part of the cargo onward and destroy the rest, or to separate entirely from it, or to ensure that what remained could never be traced back to the helicopter. Beyond this point, the trail dissolved. The marks grew fainter, then vanished altogether, as if the forest itself had drawn a line. Whoever had gone on had done so with extreme caution, or had reached a place where caution was no longer necessary. He stood there for a long time, listening to the water move over stone, to the distant sounds of the forest resuming its rhythm. The dog sat beside him, no longer searching, its task complete. Someone had walked away from the helicopter carrying more than weight. They had carried knowledge, proof, guilt, perhaps, or resolve. They had stepped out of this forest and into a world that would not welcome the truth they held, and somehow that truth had been buried just as deeply as the wreck itself. He understood now that the disappearance had not been accidental. It had been engineered, step by step, decision by decision. The men who remained behind had waited. The ones who left had chosen motion over hope. As he turned back toward the helicopter, the forest no longer felt neutral. It felt complicit. It had hidden the machine, softened the trail, erased the footprints, but it had not erased the story. It had preserved it for someone patient enough to read it. And now that he had followed the path of those who left, he knew the next question was no longer where they had gone, but why the world had allowed them to disappear at all. The walk back toward the helicopter felt longer than it should have, as though the forest were stretching the distance deliberately, forcing him to carry what he had learned without allowing him the relief of immediate stillness. Each step pulled the fragments together in his mind, not as a neat sequence, but as a pressure that demanded coherence. By the time the clearing reappeared between the trees, the story had begun to take shape with an inevitability that unsettled him more than any sudden danger could have. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at the machine again, seeing it now not as a stranded aircraft but as a remainder. Everything that mattered had already moved through this place and passed on, leaving behind only what could be safely forgotten. The helicopter was not the center of the mission. It was what had been left when the mission failed. Inside, he resumed his careful examination with a different purpose. He was no longer searching for hidden compartments or physical traces alone. He was searching for intention. He revisited the markings on the hull, the fragments of insignia nearly erased by time. He compared them to what he remembered from old photographs, from stories overheard decades ago, from manuals and equipment that had passed through his hands. The style was wrong for any officially recorded operation he knew. The numbering system was incomplete. Certain identifiers were missing entirely, as if removed before departure. That absence spoke louder than any marking could have. Official missions left trails by necessity: paperwork, authorizations, redundancies. This machine carried none of that. It was designed to move quietly, to exist briefly, and to vanish if required. The notebook confirmed it in subtle ways. There were no references to command, no mention of resupply schedules or contact points that could be verified. Instructions were implied rather than written. Decisions were framed as collective, not ordered. It read less like a logbook and more like a record kept for survival alone. Whoever had planned this operation had expected the men involved to function without oversight once airborne. He traced the dates again, aligning them mentally with what he knew of historical conflicts and covert movements. The timing fit uncomfortably well with a period when certain transfers were rumored but never acknowledged, when assets moved under cover of chaos and later reappeared in places they did not belong. The cargo made sense in that context. So did the silence that followed the crash. The realization settled heavily. These men had not been lost. They had been erased. He imagined the moment the decision was made elsewhere. A report filed, then quietly amended. A status changed from delayed to unrecoverable. A calculation performed that weighed cost against consequence and found rescue unnecessary. The forest would finish what bureaucracy began. The waiting recorded in the notebook took on a different tone now. The men had believed help would come because that belief had been necessary to continue. But beneath the practical notes, beneath the discipline, there were hints of doubt that grew more pronounced over time. Mentions of distant aircraft were followed by longer silences. Attempts at signaling diminished. Hope did not disappear all at once. It thinned. He thought of the cargo again, of the portion taken and the portion left behind. That decision, too, began to make sense. If the mission had become untenable, the priority would shift from delivery to containment. What could be carried would be carried. What could not would be hidden or destroyed. The helicopter itself, too large to erase easily, would be abandoned where nature could do the work quietly. The role of the men changed in his mind. They were no longer simply victims. They had become witnesses. And witnesses were dangerous. The one who left, carrying part of the cargo, had crossed a threshold the others could not. Whether chosen or volunteered, that person had stepped into a role that extended beyond survival. They carried proof that something had existed which powerful systems preferred forgotten. To survive with that proof required not only endurance, but silence. The forest outside remained indifferent to these conclusions. Wind moved through leaves. Light shifted across the clearing. Time continued its steady advance. But inside him, the present and the past overlapped, and the helicopter felt less like a relic and more like a statement that had never been allowed to speak. He considered what would happen if he reported this. The sequence was easy to imagine. Authorities would arrive with equipment and explanations prepared in advance. The wreck would be documented selectively, the cargo reclassified, the notebooks analyzed and then sealed. A narrative would be constructed that accounted for the minimum necessary facts and no more. He would be thanked, perhaps, and then pushed aside. The deeper truth would remain buried, only now under official layers rather than moss and roots. He also considered the other possibility: silence. The forest would continue its slow work. The helicopter would sink further into the ground. The remaining cargo would corrode, its value dissolving into irrelevance. The story would remain intact but inaccessible, preserved only in his memory and in whatever fragment of proof the survivor might still carry. Neither path felt clean. Both carried consequences he could not fully predict. He sat on the edge of the open doorway and let the weight of it settle. He had lived long enough to know that institutions did not forget by accident. They forgot because forgetting was useful. The men who had waited here had learned that lesson too late. The one who walked away had learned it just in time. The question was not whether this mission had existed. It clearly had. The question was whether allowing it to remain non-existent was an act of cowardice or restraint. He closed the notebook and returned it to its place. Outside, the dog watched him closely, sensing the tension even if it could not understand its source. He rested a hand briefly on the animal's head, grounding himself in something immediate and real. The forest had preserved the evidence of betrayal with remarkable neutrality. It had offered shelter, concealment, erasure, all without judgment. Now the burden of judgment rested with him. As the light began to shift toward afternoon, he knew the story had reached its most dangerous point. Everything that followed would be shaped by the decision he made next. The forest did not hurry him, but it did not release him either. Time moved forward with quiet persistence, and with every passing hour the knowledge he carried grew heavier, settling into his body like an unfamiliar weight he could not set down. He remained near the helicopter longer than he intended, sitting in the shadow of its open door, watching how light shifted across rusted metal and living leaves alike. The wreck no longer felt like a discovery. It felt like a responsibility. He began, inevitably, to imagine what would happen if he chose to speak. The picture formed easily, shaped by years of watching how systems reacted to things they could not fully control. First would come disbelief, thinly veiled curiosity, requests for coordinates and photographs, then urgency, masked as procedure. Vehicles would appear where no vehicles belonged. Men and women trained to catalog, secure, and silence would move through the clearing with practiced efficiency. The helicopter would be measured, cut, lifted in pieces if necessary. Its presence in the forest would end not with understanding, but with removal. The cargo would be separated from the story. Gold and artifacts would become inventory, evidence stripped of context. Documents would be copied, classified, and buried beneath layers of interpretation designed to protect reputations rather than truth. The notebook, if acknowledged at all, would be reframed as unreliable, incomplete, the desperate ramblings of men who misunderstood their own situation. The waiting, The abandonment, the deliberate forgetting would be softened into ambiguity, and his role would shrink accordingly. He would be named a finder, a passerby, a man who happened to stumble across something old. He would answer questions, then be thanked, perhaps even compensated, and advised to return to his life. If he spoke beyond the boundaries set for him, he would be corrected. If he persisted, he would be warned. If he refused to accept the new narrative, he would be marginalized until his voice carried no weight at all. Worse possibilities crept in as well, the ones he did not like to dwell on but could not entirely dismiss. If the cargo connected to living interests rather than dead ones, if the disappearance of the mission still shielded someone with influence, then silence might not be optional. Accidents happened. Witnesses changed their minds. Truth dissolved quietly. He looked down at his hands, scarred and steady, and knew that once he stepped into that world, he would not control the terms. The story would no longer belong to the men who waited here, nor to the one who walked away, nor even to the forest that had preserved their traces. It would belong to those who were best equipped to reshape it. The alternative was harder to face, not because it was dangerous, but because it demanded endurance rather than action. To say nothing meant accepting that these men would remain officially non-existent, that the waiting recorded in the notebook would never be acknowledged, that the choice to abandon them would remain unchallenged. Silence would protect the present at the cost of the past. He wrestled with the idea of taking the cargo. Not all of it, perhaps, just enough to ensure that something survived outside the forest. Gold could be sold. Artifacts could be passed on quietly. Evidence could be distributed beyond the reach of a single authority. The thought tempted him briefly, not with greed, but with the illusion of agency. But he understood the flaw immediately. Taking even a fragment would alter the balance. It would introduce new trails where none existed. It would announce interference to anyone still watching, anyone who had reason to monitor old operations and unresolved losses. The absence of cargo would speak louder than its presence. The forest could hide a wreck. It could not hide a pattern of extraction. More than that, removing the cargo would mean claiming it. Ownership, even temporary, would tether him to its history in ways he could not fully anticipate. The men who had guarded it had done so under orders, however ambiguous. He had no such mandate. To take would be to step into their place without their consent. He thought again of the personal items inside the helicopter, the folded clothing, the careful arrangement, the photograph of the child. Those objects had not been preserved for future discoverers. They had been preserved out of respect for a life left behind. To disturb them further felt wrong, not because of law or consequence, but because of an unspoken agreement between the living and the dead. His thoughts turned to the dog resting nearby, its breathing slow and even. The animal trusted him completely, followed him without question. Bringing others into this place would expose it to risks it could not understand or avoid. He had seen enough of the world to know that collateral damage was rarely acknowledged, only accepted. The weight of the choice pressed inward, forcing him to confront something he had avoided most of his life. He had always chosen solitude because it simplified responsibility. Out here, choices affected only him and the creature beside him. But now the circle had widened. The forest had placed him at the intersection of past injustice and present power, and there was no path that did not carry consequence. He searched for a third option, something between exposure and silence. What if the story did not need to be told immediately? What if truth could exist without announcement, preserved without provocation? He considered the possibility of creating a record separate from the helicopter itself. Copies of documents, photographs of markings, coordinates noted and hidden. Proof enough to matter, but not enough to trigger immediate response. Such a record would not correct the injustice, not yet, but it would ensure that forgetting was no longer complete. It would place the truth in suspension, waiting for a moment when it could be received without being consumed. The idea settled slowly, taking shape as something he could live with. He did not believe that truth always demanded an audience. Sometimes it demanded a guardian. With careful deliberation, he selected what to preserve. He photographed key pages of the notebook, focusing on dates and entries that established the length of waiting. He documented the cargo lists, including the discrepancies that suggested removal. He recorded the markings on the helicopter, the signs of modification, the absence of official identifiers. He did so methodically, minimizing disturbance, restoring each item to its place when finished. He did not touch the gold again. He did not remove any personal belongings. The forest had kept them safe for decades. It would continue to do so. When he finished, he concealed the copies in a container of his own, sealed against moisture, marked in a way only he would recognize. He chose a location far from the wreck, along a route he could reach without returning to the clearing, a place defined by natural features unlikely to change. It was not a hiding place meant to last forever. It was a pause, an interval. As the light faded toward evening, he returned one last time to the helicopter. He stood in the doorway and looked inside, committing the arrangement to memory. This was not farewell. It was acknowledgement. The choice he had made did not absolve him of responsibility. It bound him to it. He left the clearing quietly, taking care to erase the traces of his passage as much as possible. The forest accepted him back without resistance, branches closing, sounds returning to their previous rhythm. Within minutes, the helicopter was invisible again, reduced to a disturbance only the patient eye could find. As he walked, he felt no relief, only a sober clarity. He had chosen not to speak, but not to forget. He had chosen not to act loudly, but not to remain passive. The truth would endure, not as a weapon, but as a burden carried deliberately. And he understood, with a certainty that surprised him, that this choice would shape the rest of his life more than anything that had come before. He left the clearing the way he had entered it, slowly and without ceremony, letting the forest decide how much of him it would remember. His steps followed the marks he had made earlier, subtle signs placed with intention and now erased with equal care. Broken twigs were returned to their places. Scuffed soil was brushed smooth. Where his boots had pressed too deeply, he stepped elsewhere on the return, distributing the weight of his passage so that no single line could be followed for long. The dog moved ahead and behind him in quiet loops, attentive but calm, as if it understood that this departure required a different kind of vigilance. The forest accepted the correction without protest. Leaves shifted back into place. Branches swayed, then settled. Sounds resumed their layered rhythm, insects reclaiming the spaces where silence had gathered. Within minutes, the clearing no longer existed as a destination. It was a memory carried in his body rather than a place that could be pointed to. As the distance grew, the weight of the helicopter receded, not from his thoughts, but from his senses. The smell of rust faded. The particular stillness that had clung to the wreck dissolved into the broader hush of old growth and moving air. What remained was not relief, but an aftertaste, the kind that lingered long after a difficult truth had been swallowed. He moved through terrain that felt suddenly ordinary, though nothing about it had changed. The same roots broke the surface. The same trunks rose and fell with the land. Yet, he was aware now of a quiet separation between himself and the world beyond the trees. Somewhere, not far away, people lived lives unmarked by what lay beneath this canopy. Roads cut clean lines through earth. Buildings rose and fell according to schedules and permits. The forest stood beside that order without acknowledgement, keeping what it had taken. He stopped once at a small rise where the ground sloped toward a stream he recognized. From there, he could have followed the water back toward familiar ground, toward the edges where maps resumed their authority. He stood and listened, letting the sound of moving water anchor him in the present. The dog sat at his side, its posture relaxed, its work complete. In his mind, the faces from the photographs returned, not sharply, but with a softened persistence. He did not imagine their voices or reconstruct their arguments. He thought instead of the patience that had kept them alive as long as it had. The discipline of arranging tools, of recording dates, of guarding cargo that had already cost them rescue. That patience had outlasted them, carried forward by the forest and now by him. He resumed walking, choosing a route that would carry him away from the clearing without crossing his earlier trail. Each choice felt deliberate, weighted by awareness rather than fear. He understood that the act of leaving did not end his involvement. It merely shifted it into a quieter form. When the signs of other people began to appear again, they felt distant and unreal. A faded blaze on a tree. The remains of an old campsite long abandoned. A stretch of ground compacted by repeated foot traffic. These were traces of ordinary presence, casual and transient. None of them hinted at the kind of endurance he had witnessed deeper in the forest. By the time he reached the point where he had concealed the record he created, the light had begun to thin. He paused there briefly, not to check his work, but to acknowledge it. The container lay hidden where stone met root, protected from water and prying eyes by the land itself. It was not a monument. It was not a message. It was a possibility, deferred. He did not linger. The purpose of the hiding place was not reassurance, but restraint. If he returned to it too often, it would become a habit, and habits left patterns. He marked the location in his mind and moved on, trusting memory rather than repetition. As the forest gradually loosened its hold and the ground began to show signs of regular passage, he felt the separation more sharply. The knowledge he carried did not fade with distance. It sharpened, settling into him as something that would not easily be shared. He knew that even if he spoke someday, the telling would never be simple. Words would fracture the story, flatten it, strip it of the quiet complexity that gave it meaning. At the edge of the trees, where the first suggestion of an open path emerged, he stopped again. The dog looked back at him, waiting. He took one last glance into the deeper forest, not searching for the clearing, but acknowledging its continued existence. Somewhere beyond his sight, the helicopter rested, changing slowly, its metal surrendering to soil, its contents waiting without expectation. The forest would continue to do what it had always done, turning evidence into earth, noise into silence. He stepped forward and crossed the invisible boundary back into the world where explanations were demanded and choices were judged. The sounds changed. The air felt thinner. The ground hardened beneath his boots. He did not turn back. In the days that followed, the forest remained with him in unexpected ways. In the way he listened longer before speaking. In the way he avoided questions that sought simple answers. In the way, he felt the pull of quiet places more strongly than before. He did not announce what he had found. He did not share it with anyone. The story lived on as a private alignment of facts and decisions, reshaping his sense of what responsibility meant. Time moved forward, indifferent as ever. Seasons shifted. The forest thickened and thinned in its rhythms. The helicopter sank a little deeper, roots tightening their hold, rust flaking away into the soil. The remaining cargo dulled and darkened, its value eroded not by thieves or officials, but by time itself. The names written in the notebook remained, held in darkness, unspoken but intact. He understood, eventually, that not all truths were meant to surface at once. Some existed to be carried, not revealed, waiting for a moment when the world could receive them without bending them into something else. Until then, they required guardians rather than witnesses. On certain mornings, when the air carried the same damp weight it had on the day he followed his dog into unfamiliar ground, he felt the forest call to him again. Not as an invitation, but as a reminder. He would shoulder his pack, move into the trees, and walk with the knowledge that beneath his feet lay stories that did not ask to be told, only to remembered. And the forest, patient and unjudging, would keep what remained. Before you leave, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter and other stories like this one. Watch the following videos to uncover more hidden truths, forgotten discoveries, and stories the world tried to erase. And if this story stayed with you, share it. Someone else needs to see it too,